Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. That is a wonderful line from Paul. As a teacher, as well as a priest and a preacher, it's one of my go-to lines for inspiration. When I want to know, what ought I do for God and the kingdom today? Phrases like that are on the short list of ones to think about. What can you do today, Mr. Wilkins, to not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by renewing your mind? What can you learn today that you don't know that will help you and help other people if you know it? What can you learn to understand in a fresh and clean way that may help? What maybe do you need to pack up in boxes inside your head maybe and put out to the curb, making way for new things, getting rid of the old that might not be there anymore? In the process of going through the books I own and various things that may be better used for other people now, having that process underway. So are my boys as they prepare and have left on for their schooling this year. What do you want to take with you on your journey? Another way to ask this question: what do you need to leave behind? What has served its purpose and now may be left alone, left aside or put away, right? Those things which help us discern what is the will of God. And if you're wondering what God wants, these three adjectives from Paul help us understand what is good, what is acceptable, what is perfect. It's intriguing to me that those aren't all the same things. You see, perfect's up here. Have you ever known anything that's perfect? Anyone that's perfect? I mean, no flaws. Their motivations are always the right ones. Their spirit's always up. Their ears are always open. Their compassion's always showing. Their love shines through. I've known people that are close. Never anybody that was perfect. Never anything that was perfect as well. Things that are perfect are so good that to me I can't imagine that something's not going to come along and mess it up, right? The most beautiful scene you can see, whether it's a mountaintop or the most beautiful sunrise or sunset on the sea, or the face of a smiling child or a happy couple at their wedding, all those things that are just moments of utter, overwhelming beauty. Overwhelm me, as I said, and they also scare me sometimes because I think that's so good and the world can be so cruel. How long will that wonderful thing last before something comes along to hurt it, to mar it, out of envy or jealousy or whatever it is, just plain old meanness? Maybe I'm a little too cynical, who knows, but I always wonder when I'm in the midst of something wonderful, what comes next? When does the shoe drop? When does all this promise turn into loss and suffering? It turns out that's a good thing to think about today, because our lessons as they continue through the early books of the Bible, through the Torah, reminds us yet again of that downward slope that so often happens in life. There's an upslope too. You know, for every Good Friday there's an Easter morning. For every slaver in Egypt there's a release from Moses and the promise of the promised land to come. But to get to the high point, we have to visit the low points, and the church lectionary leads us there in this season of our worship together. And we hear of the absolute terrifying and unjustifiable horror of the slavery of the Hebrew people in Egypt. All born, ladies and gentlemen, of the ancient world's equivalent of racism. Very simple. King of Egypt, Pharaoh, says, them over there, they're not like us. They ain't from here. They're not our people. They're going to hurt us. We need to oppress them so they can't. It appears never to have occurred to him what had occurred to Joseph when he brought those people into his land. They were dying at home. They didn't have anything to eat. Joseph said, "Come on, you immigrate down here. Move to where we are. There's food enough and for everybody. We can all be one society. Maybe not all one big family. There's millions of us, but we can all be one society. Some of us is from here. Some of us are from there. We're all going to find a way to live together and be one people." Later generations in Egypt, the pharaohs and the people that were in charge decided that wasn't the way they wanted to do things. They decided it'd be a whole lot easier if we use those people as slaves and worse. And if they get too numerous, start getting rid of them. Get rid of the males and we'll keep the women for ourselves, was the basic thing he sets up. Put them in hard service, make their lives bitter, every kind of mortar and brick service and every kind of field labor. Be ruthless with them and all the rest of it, and then we'll find a way to hurt them even more. And it turns out if you set out to do damage to human beings and you have all the power, you can do a lot of damage to human beings. Doesn't make it right, makes it even more wrong, but it is true. But the second part of that truth is people can understand when you're hurting them and they find ways to resist what you are doing. The story bears out in several key and important details. And it turns out in this particular part of the book of Exodus, it's the women of the Hebrew people and certain allies among the Egyptians who make the difference. Given a insanely impossible, brutal, and ridiculous order to kill all the boy children, they simply refuse to comply. And they lie to the king about why, and the authorities, why they're doing it. And he has to come up with a new strategy which seems to have been a little more effective, sad as it is to say. But they resisted from the get-go. People will do that. Had that Pharaoh chosen a different path, had he chosen to keep with Joseph's promise and make all the people one, so we can all lift ourselves up together and make a nation good as well as great, the story may not have proceeded as it did. But that Pharaoh chose to put people down. And as we know, he earned the reward that comes to people who choose to divide, who choose to oppress, who choose to keep people down and treat them inhumanely. And one of the things that I find renews my mind and helps me transform myself to discern and ideally follow the will of God is to remind myself of the awesome power that human beings have to resist and overcome. To be able to hope that today's bad things can be overturned by tomorrow's better things. That today's oppressions are not the last word, that today's evils are not the last thing that is spoken, and that even the horrors that we can see in our own time are neither the will of God nor the last word that the people of God have to say on the subject. Those who would follow the path of the Messiah, the Son of the living God, must, Paul says, never conform to the world, never participate in the cycle by which people choose to do each other harm, but always transform that world to make the Easter mornings come from the Good Fridays, to turn horror into joy, to turn oppression into release, and to make a difference that is good in the world Christ lived to change, died to save, and rose to redeem. In all that spirit we find the power of God made real. And when I get to places where I don't see hope, this verse from Romans is there to remind me to keep looking, transform myself to see it again. Remind yourself of the glory and greatness that people can be and do, not just the bad that some choose. Remind ourselves of humanity's incredible capacity to overcome, and not only of its terrible power to destroy. May the power of that God help us not conform to this world, but be transformed by renewing our minds. May whatever path that leads you on be rich and rewarding, restore you to hope when hope falters. Keep your eyes on the prize and looking forward, that we may all be one and make the world that we live in more like the world God made it to be than it has ever been. Amen.